Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our last Naturalist night of the year. I'm very excited to be here tonight with Dr. Andrew Gray. Dr. Gray is an assistant professor in watershed hydrology at UC Riverside. And his lab is working on a project. They just got started working on a project actually on microplastics in our watershed and in the Newport Bay itself. So like I said, they just got started on that project, so I'm sure he'll tell us more, but they haven't actually done any sampling in the bay yet, but they will be doing that. And I'm excited to have him here to tell us more about plastic pollution in general, the microplastic problem, and his project. So welcome, Dr. Gray.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. As Hillary mentioned, we've just recently gotten started in the Bay, just over the last year or so. So it's great to finally start to connect with some local folks and stakeholders, and we're looking forward to doing a lot more of that as we move on. And in part because we're just kind of getting started on that project, I've oriented this talk around the plastics pollution problem more in general. And also focused on a bit of a larger spatial domain, Southern California. And the idea here is just to try to get all of you a little better oriented on plastics pollution and microplastics pollution in general, kind of where the field's at right now. And then I'm also going to try to highlight some of the different projects that my group is working on that span the gamut from macro, larger plastics to microplastics. And as I mentioned to Hillary before you all get on, if you have any questions as I go through, feel free to throw them up in the chat. Feel free to just pipe up and interrupt me at any time. I put together kind of a long chat, so feel free to ask questions whenever they come up. So without further ado, see if I can operate this. Great. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, we're good. So I'm a hydrologist and a geomorphologist, and what that means is really all of my research revolves around water and sediment. And before I got into microplastics about 4 years ago, my group was mostly focusing on post-wildfire erosion and sediment transfer, watershed scale suspended sediment dynamics, coastal geomorphology and sedimentology, and using sediment deposits in coastal systems as records of past change, and kind of really, investigating the natural sediment cascade through watersheds and into coastal systems, as it were. But, as I started to learn a little bit more about plastics pollution, I realized that really we're just dealing with particles in the environment, in this case, wholly anthropogenic particles, and particles that differ from the kinds that my group usually studies in many important ways, but that also have a lot of similarities. And it seemed like the field could benefit from more physical scientists getting involved, particularly on the fate and transport side of things. And one of the real catalysts for me to finally jump into this work was a really fantastic graduate student that joined my group 4 years ago, Wynn Cowger, who's just finishing up his PhD right now. And he came in with that passion and convinced me to really get started with this. And since that time, we've written grants, we've grown our group, we've pulled in new projects, and now we have 3 graduate students, including Samiksha Singh, a Fulbright International Fellow, and Claire Murphy-Hagan. And then we're up to at least 8 undergraduates now, and we're actually in the process of recruiting some more. And as you'll see, one of the reasons we need so many people is beyond the proliferation of projects that we're working on, it just takes a tremendous amount of work to monitor these particles in the environment and then characterize them back in the laboratory. So just to get started, all of you are familiar with the fact that there's a lot of plastics in our lives, and humanity at this point is producing a tremendous amount of plastic on a yearly basis. So this is actually an older study from about 4 years ago, where Geyer calculated that we were producing on the order of 8,300 million metric tons of plastic every year, and it's higher than that now. And then this schematic shows a bit of the plastics production, processing, and fate cycle. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but my point here really is that we produce a lot of plastic, and a lot of that plastic is discarded every year. And we're talking about really huge numbers here. So plastic that escapes from this system, from our waste management side of the system, even relatively small amounts of it add up to a lot of plastics entering our environment. And that ends up being, this big blue arrow over here is the root of all the problems I'm talking about. So I'd like to start with this when I talk about plastics, because I focus on fate and transport, and I get really into the details of plastics being transported through the environment. Some might misconstrue that to think that I think that's where the solutions are. And it couldn't be further from the truth, right? That there are targeted solutions there in some cases, but this big blue arrow and some of this other stuff that's going on in this schematic and the circular economy that could arise out of that's where the real solutions are. So I might be cutting my talk off a bit at the knees there before we even get started, but I just wanted to make sure I got that out. So not only are we producing a tremendous amount of plastic right now, but there's two other things I really want to point out, and this is also from another earlier paper from Geyer, is that one, if you see these lines as a time series going from 1950 and into the future, and different parts of this plastic production and its waste stream, you'll see that this problem really started in the 60s, right? And if you look at these millions of metric tons of production, the amount of plastic that we produced has expanded geometrically over the last 50, 60 years, and is projected to continue to increase dramatically for a lot of reasons. And so not only are we facing an issue where we're producing a tremendous amount of plastics, and a lot of them are getting into the environment, but we're likely going to continue to produce more and more over the coming decades, unless things change dramatically. So even though we're the ones producing the plastic, and we mostly live on land, and we see plastic pollution around us all the time, I think a lot of us agree that this kind of modern movement, or this modern consciousness of plastic pollution, was catalyzed in many ways by the realization that we were finding plastics far away from land, far away from the zone of production, and in fact finding higher concentrations of it out in the middle of the ocean, in these ocean convergence zones, in these gyres, than anybody really expected. And I think that played a big role in sort of waking people up to the fact that we were producing so much plastic that it was that it was starting to impact the whole Earth system. And this was work that was in part really engendered by Charlie Moore, who's still here in SoCal and still working on the plastic pollution problem. But of course, as we've researched the fate and transport of plastics more over time, this concern with plastics pollution in the oceans has again sort of refocused to look back on land. As someone who, I cut my teeth in suspended sediment, flux, and dynamics in rivers, folks in my field very well know that the rivers are the major transporting agent of solid materials from terrestrial Earth to the oceans. And indeed, that appears to also be the case for plastics. So it seems like the major flux at the global scale of plastics into the oceans is actually through the transport of rivers. And there have been there's been a lot of work lately to try to estimate those fluxes. And these aren't the most recent numbers that people have come up with. All of these numbers are actually highly uncertain, in large part because we just don't have that much monitoring yet. And that's a drum that I'm going to continue to beat throughout this talk, because I think it's super important for us to characterize the problem, and it's also part of what my lab specializes in. But the estimates for the flux of plastics to the oceans from rivers is on the order of a couple of megatons per year at this point, something around that, right? So not the 8,300 megatons of production a year, but still what seems to be a large number. So as I go a little further in this talk, I'll first introduce the concept of macroplastic and microplastics. Like a lot of other particles that we deal with, we have many different ways to define them and measure them. When it comes to plastics, we often now define them first on the basis of size. So macroplastics are just larger pieces of plastic, nominally larger than 5 millimeters, and microplastics are those that are less than 5 millimeters. And some people would say that goes down to 1 micron, and that's up for debate as well. As you'll see as we go through the talk, many things remain up for debate. It's a contaminant or a suite of contaminants of emerging concern, and we're still figuring a lot of things out, even when it comes to definitions. So as we start thinking about plastics pollution in watersheds, which is where these plastics are coming from, ultimately, that are ending up in rivers and then being transported to coastal oceans, we can split that up then in terms of macroplastics and microplastics. And there's some reasons actually why we'd want to do that from a transport perspective. And that's how I'll kind of march through the rest of this talk. We'll first discuss macroplastics a bit in terms of characterization, supply, fate, and transport, monitoring and management, and then we'll go into microplastics. And I'll finish up by talking a little bit about impacts of microplastics, but not too much, in part because I'm not a toxicologist, but also because there's just still so much that we don't know. So we're all used to macroplastics. We live around plastics all the time. All these larger pieces of plastic you use and then perhaps discard or see in your environment are macroplastics. We've been characterizing them in the environment as pollutants for a long, long time. I assume so many of you, you're all affiliated with this Nature Conservancy. Probably most of you have done some cleanups, right, in the past, where you've gone out and put the hard work in and picked up trash off of beaches and wetlands, off the side of roads. One of the things that the broader mismanaged waste field is trying to do more and more now is actually collect data, right? While we're also remediating the environment. But one of the issues is we have many, many different kinds of data cards, and it's very difficult to synthesize those data at the end of the day. And I'll talk about that a little bit. When we think about particles moving through watersheds and river systems, the sort of, I think of the natural analog for macroplastic as streamwood, right? You have a wide range of sizes, shapes, and compositions, and also a lot of the same problems when it comes to monitoring and measuring streamwood in river systems as we do with macroplastics. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And this is all I'm going to say about environmental impacts with macroplastics in this talk, but essentially the impacts are well documented. There are a lot of aesthetic impacts. We just don't like to see it in the environment, and that is it impacts human beneficial uses. But also there are many documented adverse impacts with aquatic biota through ingestion or entanglement, as well as other toxicological impacts as well in some cases. And we also have a more robust suite of federal and state regulations for dealing with macroplastics in the environment, which are largely absent at this point for microplastics, although that is changing. So in terms of the issue of trash monitoring and categorization, at this point, as I said, there's many different approaches. And at this point, our field is also trying to move towards standardization of those efforts so that we can start to bring this wealth of professional and to a large degree, citizen science data together to better understand the drivers of the production and supply of macroplastic pollution and trash to the environment, and also its fate and transport. And so my group has been working on this by developing a trash taxonomy. We've been collaborating or working with the California Ocean Litter Strategy on this topic, the California Trash Monitoring Work Group, and we've had a small project funded to fund an undergraduate to help us with our development of this trash taxonomy, which is really an effort to harmonize across the wide range of data cards that people are using for monitoring trash in the environment. And that should be published soon. But when we think about the supply, fate, and transport of trash and macroplastics in the environment, it's really an issue that involves both point source elements, where you have discrete dumping, leakage from or re-entry to the environment from discrete locations in the solid waste management stream. But then you also have this massive non-point source issue, right? That comes back to, individual members of the community littering, and so on and so forth. But it really becomes, in a lot of ways, the same kind of issue that we're dealing with when we're monitoring natural particles and their movement through watersheds. In other words, a very complex issue because it involves such a broad diversity of sources across the watershed. So one of the things my research group has been working on is to actually do higher resolution trash surveys in residential and urban settings. These are surveys that involve the use of a widely available cell phone app that facilitates the logging, photographing, and geolocating of trash items. This is a project that initially spanned 1 month and has had a couple different iterations. And it's the first report on our results are currently in review. And this is just sort of scratching the tip of the iceberg. But the idea here is to develop more robust data sets that we can use to better understand what's controlling the generation and in some cases, initial transport of trash, litter, macroplastic that's entering urban and residential environments. Once these materials get into waterways, there are lots of interesting issues that we have to deal with, right? We have large, small-ish to very large objects that end up in streams. I've already mentioned before that I think of them as sort of being analogous to streamwood in some ways. Analogous in terms of, the scale of the introduction of these materials to these waterways. Also in terms of the temporal scales over which it takes for a piece of material that's, say, introduced into a watershed or the waterway to make its way through that system, to be transported through. And we also have very, very similar transport characteristics as well, and similar challenges that we face when it comes to monitoring macroplastics in rivers, whether that's in repose, so as something that's deposited in a channel, or in flux. And then both of these kinds of materials, plastics and streamwood, as they're moving through these systems, they may finally be exported, or they may never leave in their initial form because they may experience some kind of comminution or physical or chemical breakdown as they move through the system and turn into something else. In the case of streamwood, it's particulate organic carbon and dissolved organic carbon. In the case of macroplastics, well, that's microplastics. So the monitoring approaches that we use in rivers for whatever it is, any kind, what we call fluvial constituents or anything that's moving along with the water, whether it's dissolved or in this case in particulate form, we can monitor that in an ambient fashion, which I liken to just a dipstick. If you go down to a river, you take a sample and you want to find out the concentration that's there, that's an ambient sample. But we can also do more dynamical or flux-based sampling, where we're not only interested in the concentration, but we want to know the flux of that material through the system. And perhaps we also want to know the flux of the material into the system. So those are our two kind of basic concepts for monitoring these materials that get into rivers. And I'll come back to that again as we get into microplastics as well. So to bring this a little more into the Southern California focus, lots of groups have been collecting trash all around Southern California for a very long time for lots of reasons. But more recently, we've had changes in regulations that have led to the trash TMDLs, right? Where in general, trash is, at least from a regulatory sense, no longer tolerated in rivers and streams, right? And that's engendered another wave of, or reinvigorated maybe even more stream surveys for trash over the past 5 to 10 years. And this particular study that was headed up by the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, they found that in the stream surveys they were doing, and so these are ambient surveys where you're walking through streams and recording information about the amount and the character of trash that's found in those stream systems. So you're not monitoring it in transport and flux, but just in repose deposited in the stream. They found that plastic dominates, as you would probably expect, right? If you think about the kinds of objects and items that we're consuming and then also disposing of on a day-to-day basis. That's what this red parts of all of these bars are for these different regions in Southern California, for the entire SoCal region, and then other regions that have been split up on the basis of predominant land use, and then also by county. And so, as I mentioned, these macroplastics, because they're greater than 5 millimeters in size, that's also the nominal cutoff for the definition of trash in California, right? So macroplastics are regulated in streams in California. Microplastics are less than 5 millimeters in size, so they're not regulated in streams in California at this time. But because, in part because some of these regulations are in place that are driving more monitoring, also because many groups are doing monitoring, that starts to present opportunities to utilize data sets, monitoring-based data sets, to try to answer questions, right? There's many different kinds of questions you could try to answer. One of the most important, perhaps, kinds of questions that people would like answers to are some of the remediation or legislative activities that are going on to try to reduce plastic pollution, are those actually working, right? And you can't answer that from an observational perspective unless you have the kind of monitoring data to back it up. And so this project led by Squirp found some evidence that regions that had instituted plastic bag bans seemed to be finding less amounts of plastic bags in waterways, right? An initial finding, significant finding, but also just very preliminary. And there are more studies like this out there in the US and throughout the world, but they're relatively far and few between, in part because it's a tremendous amount of work to collect those data, and also because it's hard to collect that much, and it's hard to do it over a large enough scale where you can actually unite data sets.
Good.
Any questions? Oh, here we go. I think I missed one. Does glass persist longer than plastic? Peter asked that. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. There are a lot of open questions about the persistence of different plastics in different parts of the environment. The amount of time that plastic can stay in the environment, it depends how you frame the question. If you frame it in terms of just finding that polymer or finding it within a certain size class. But really at the end of the day, it depends on the environmental conditions that the plastic experiences and the kind of plastic that you're dealing with. And really at the end of the day, we're dealing with thousands and thousands of different kinds of plastics, even though the most predominant ones that we find fall within maybe a dozen categories or so. So it's hard to say. But glass can persist very, very long. It also gets broken down physically over time. It doesn't break down so much from a chemical perspective. Plastics can stay in the environment for decades or even centuries or longer, depending on what they're exposed to. It could be maybe even be thousands of years. UV light is one of the major factors in breaking down plastics. So plastics that stay in surface waters and move out into the ocean and stay at the surface are broken down much more quickly than those, in general, than those that end up getting deposited in sediment systems along the way. But yeah, feel free to ask questions at any time. And so, as I mentioned, in terms of trash and macroplastics, there's US EPA guidance that goes back all the way to the 70s, if not earlier, on managing trash in aquatic systems. There have been a lot of recent item-specific bans that have happened, particularly over the last 10 or 20 years, from plastic bags to single-use products, et cetera. And then we have this 2015 California State Water Board trash amendments that at this point, has required all NPDES stormwater permittees to really work towards zero trash discharge by 2030. And there's a lot of ways that people are trying to do that. And this has also, in some cases, led to some adoption of stormwater and streamflow remediation measures, these sort of end of the line issues once a system's already polluted, to try to remove trash from the system. Although those are relatively far and few between and very expensive. Although we do have some good examples here in SoCal, including in the Newport Bay watershed. So this topic, though, of the persistence and the breakdown of macroplastics is really important, and it ties right into the second phase of this talk, right? So when it comes to microplastics, we really have there's many different ways you can subdivide this complex suite of contaminants. But one major way to do that is in terms of primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. Primary microplastics were produced by humans within the microplastic size range. We produce them in that size, usually for a reason. That could be industrial pellets that are being moved somewhere else to be then utilized to make plastic products. It could be microbeads, which we used to actually have in a lot of cosmetics and other products for a period of time. That's actually one of the legislative wins in terms of microplastics pollution. The fact that at a national level, we have legislation that bans the use of microbeads in cosmetics, which is interesting. But by and large, we don't have much in the way of regulations yet. And the other kinds of microplastics are secondary microplastics that are being produced as smaller particles that are breaking off of larger, either larger microplastic particles or larger macroplastic particles. And I've mentioned this before, but it's very, very important. This is one of the things that makes the microplastics pollution problem so difficult to study and so difficult to obtain answers on when it comes to a lot of the questions that we really want to understand, which is namely, like, is this a problem, right? Is it a problem for aquatic ecosystems? Is it a problem for human health? One of the big challenges there is that we're not just talking about a given chemical. We're talking about thousands and thousands of different chemicals. And we're not just talking about a specific kind of particle. We're talking about a wide range of sizes. So from 5,000 microns to 1 micron. So we're spanning more than 3 orders of magnitude in size, and many, many, many different morphologies, right? From beads to fragments, to microfibers, to films, and so on and so forth. Even glitter. This is actually hot off the presses. One of my students finally found glitter. We've had some ongoing jokes and discussions about, like really devastating my children, for example, by banning glitter in this country. But we hadn't really found any definitive glitter in the environment yet, but there's some glitter. And actually there's a microbead too, which is supposed to be illegal right next to it, right? But of course, we'll be finding these things in the environment for years and decades to come, even long after they're banned. So that makes it a problem for us to really understand their impacts, and it also makes it difficult for us to study them, particularly in the context of fate and transport, which I'll go into in a little more detail. So if we start looking at a number of the initial studies of microplastics in river systems, in rivers and streams around the world, there are lots of problems with comparing these numbers because, again, these are just numbers of particles. And I just said, microplastic is not a microplastic, is not a microplastic, which is what Chelsea Rockman says up at University of Toronto, but also because the ways in which these rivers were sampled is likely very different across many of these studies, and the ways in which those samples were processed in the lab are also quite a bit different. And I'll talk about that a little more later, maybe too much, we'll see. You can always tell me to kind of, pick up the pace and skip over some things. But my point here is that beyond all those issues of comparison, so far we're seeing something like 7 orders of magnitude variation and concentration of microplastics in rivers around the world. So from something where you're finding maybe 1 particle per 10 cubic meters of water that you've sampled, right? It's like, what is that, 10,000 liters, right? 1 particle per 10,000 liters to 1 million particles per 1,000 liters, right? That's a huge range. And it's perhaps what you'd expect, right? Because we have watersheds that you would expect would have a very, very wide range in the amount of plastics that are being introduced to the watershed and then introduced to the river. That also can make it rather difficult to get started on a microplastics monitoring program, right? What kind of concentration would you expect to find? And sampling kind of cubic meters or tens of cubic meters of water at a time can be pretty daunting, as my students will tell you. You'll see some pictures of them facing those challenges. So, as we kind of start moving towards me finally talking about some of our work in SoCal on microplastics, I should mention this really seminal large study that was conducted up in the San Francisco Bay and its sort of adjacent portions of its watershed between 2017 and 2018. That was conducted by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Many of you have probably heard of them. They're somewhat analogous to SCORP, which is the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project that we have down here in SoCal, something of a joint powers authority situation. And that work was done, with 5 gyres, University of Toronto and University of California, Davis, not my study. But this was one of the largest projects at its time aimed at monitoring the inputs into this coastal marine system. And so they monitored wastewater, stormwater, they monitored the abundance of plastics in the surface of San Francisco Bay. And some of their real seminal findings that help to inform the studies that I'm going to talk to you about are the fact that, as I would expect, as someone who specializes in suspended sediment transport in rivers, they found much more microplastics loading San Francisco Bay from stormwater than from wastewater. It's been a lot of concern with wastewater as a point source of microplastics, and it's a valid concern. And in some cases, in terms of wastewater discharge, it's a big component of the budget. However, a lot of wastewater treatment systems we're finding are removing quite a bit of the microplastics. Now, those microplastics end up going into biosolids, and something happens with those biosolids, right? And so that's another part of how microplastics can get circled back into other environmental compartments, including watersheds. And I won't talk about that in this talk, but it's something my group is also interested in. But the point is, stormwater is important, and highly urbanized and industrialized watersheds appear to be producing a lot more microplastics than agricultural or open space watersheds, as you would expect. But both of those things point toward, well, if we're going to start studying microplastics in Southern California, one, study them in Southern California. We have a lot of people and industries, so we probably have a lot of microplastics. And 2, study stormwater, right? So some of the work that my group has started to do on microplastics in watersheds and in rivers and streams and coastal systems, for us, it kind of started with shaking things out in the middle reach of the Santa Ana River, which is just in our backyard, basically. And then we've moved on to a project focused on San Pedro Bay, where we're monitoring some of the major rivers that are discharging into San Pedro Bay, We also started out with that project having some wastewater monitoring incorporated, but that's moved on to another project that's monitoring a lot of wastewater systems across SoCal. And then also doing coastal marine monitoring of water and sediment in San Pedro Bay. And then also this project in Newport Bay, which I'm sure all of you are interested in because this is Newport Bay Conservancy. This is our newest funded project for microplastics. So this is a project that's funded by the State Water Board. The San Pedro Bay project is funded by the NOAA Marine Debris Research Program in collaboration with SQUIRP and then also Orange County Sanitation District. The Newport Bay project is funded by the State Water Board. We're in partnership with the Santa Ana Regional Board and collaborating with Orange County I always mix it up, environmental resources, who are helping us to some degree with sampling. And we meet with all of those groups monthly on this project. So the idea behind the Newport Bay project is also monitoring the flux of microplastics from the major freshwater inputs into Newport Bay. In this case, we're monitoring macroplastics and microplastics, and we're also going into the bay and monitoring sediments in the bay. So, okay, I guess I could have put this slide up as I talked about my partners. There they are. And they've all been really fantastic to work with. It's been a great collaboration so far. So this project nominally started in 2020. We really didn't get off the ground until we didn't get our funding in place until very late in 2020. And as you know, that was well into the COVID pandemic. In fact, my graduate student that started on this project, Claire, moved out here during the pandemic last summer and hit the ground running. My lab's been able to keep running in a somewhat reduced fashion throughout the pandemic with a lot of precautions in place, but it has slowed us down a lot. But at this point, well, anyway, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just introduce the fundamentals of the project. We're monitoring. Well, I already mentioned the channels and the sediment, and I guess I should really just say that the main idea here is really an exploratory study, right? It's very difficult to collect enough samples to answer all the questions that we'd like to answer. But the idea is to get some baselines for microplastic and macroplastic flux into the bay, and then to start getting some ideas as to what the rates of accretion or rates of incorporation of microplastics into the sediments that are being deposited onto the marsh and into the benthos of the bay. So for macroplastic, our main focus there is to try to get some kind of estimation of macroplastic flux through the flow of river and stream water that's coming into the bay. And it's really challenging to do. People have done this for streamwood, our sort of natural analog, using remote cameras and really just trying to identify pieces of wood that are floating down rivers. And folks led by Tim Ben Emmerich over in Europe have started to do this for trash and macroplastics as well, with some success. And so we've been trying to adapt those techniques as well for monitoring plastics moving through rivers, moving with river flow, using video cameras, starting in the Santa Ana River. And we're now starting to do that in Newport Bay too. I had a really good video of a tremendous piece of macroplastic trash coming down the San Diego Creek. It was actually, I think, a stolen kayak with a couple of guys in it, and it rolled over during the storm. They made it out alive, but I wasn't sure if I had permission to show their faces because we never actually got their names. So I won't share that with you, but it was a wild night for my students anyway. So we have documented macroplastic influx. And we'll see how that goes. That also requires some further calibration with other kinds of sampling as well. For the sediment studies that we're doing a combination of grab and sediment coring. So Orange County Natural Resources has Environmental Resources has been going out and collecting some grab samples for us. Once we have permissions to go into the marsh, we'll do some core collections there this fall. And our usual technique in these emergent marshes is to use a vibrocore system where we're vibrating aluminum irrigation pipe into the ground. There's been quite a bit of work done in this marsh already in terms of dating sediment deposits and examining their characteristics, led by the USGS, and so we'll be piggybacking off of what they already know. But my lab's set up to do all this kind of stuff, so we'll be studying the sediments in those cores, processing them for microplastics, but also dating the core deposits, right? Dating different materials that we find, so with C14 dating, but then also utilizing our capabilities. We have a multi-channel gamma spectrometer, and we study fallout radionuclides, and we use them as chronometers, and we can use that to date recent sediment deposits using lead-210 and bomb cesium techniques. And so in that way, we can estimate rates of sedimentation, so rates of sediment that's building up at these sites. And then if we have the concentration of microplastics, we can estimate rates of microplastic deposition. That brings us to the streamflow sampling. So initially we were just going to sample at San Diego Creek, but in working with our collaborators and stakeholders, decided to expand that to also sampling the Santa Ana Delhi. And we've also decided to do a little bit of sampling at the San Joaquin Marsh diversion as well. We're not going to do enough to really actually get a good estimate of how much microplastics may be being removed from the system and deposited in the San Joaquin Marsh, but it'll be a good kind of first glimpse, first little check on that. And so the idea here is we're collecting samples during the dry season, during these dry flows, but really also focusing on wet season storm flow as well. You may notice that these numbers of samples seem really small, and they're small in number, but they're mighty in terms of effort, as you'll see. And that's the reason. If you see a microplastic study where they're talking about hundreds of samples, then give me a call and tell me what they've figured out, because we're all trying, as you'll see, we're all trying to find a silver bullet, and it doesn't exist yet. So, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you actually have to sample the microplastics, and it's a bit of a challenge, right? What we want is representative sampling, and we also, want to use our hydrology minds to head off potential complications and challenges that arise or introduced by hydrologic regime dependence on the part of microplastics composition and concentration. So I come from the natural sediment world. I did my PhD largely on suspended sediment transport in rivers. And rivers, my graduate student Wynn Cowger tells me that I have a negative buoyancy particle bias, which means like I'm used to working with particles that are more dense than water, that sink when you put them in water. And so when you're dealing with mineral sediment, as I have, as particles become larger, let's say they all have the same density and shape, as they get larger, it's harder for a given flow to move them, right? And so the largest particles that can move are moving as what we call bed load. They're just skipping, rolling, bumping along the bottom. Suspended load transport are particles that their position in the flow field is maintained by the turbulent fluctuations of the flow field itself, which are counteracting the gravitational acceleration of those particles towards the bottom. So they're not being maintained in flow by bouncing off the bottom. It's actually the fluctuation of the energetics of the flow field. Now, even then, the larger particles, the larger parts of the suspended load will have a higher concentration towards the bottom, right? The smallest particles, though, will be well mixed, and you'll actually have uniform concentration. That's what I mean here by these fine particles throughout the flow field, right? This is suspended load. This uniformly mixed stuff is called wash load for us. That stuff's really easy to sample because I can just take some from anywhere and I will have a representative sample. It's also a tremendous amount of particles when it comes to natural sediment. But if you're going to be dealing with things that have these concentration profiles that are dependent on the energetics of the flow field, then you have to think about variation with depth and variation also across the channel cross section that you're sampling at. And so that for that reason, it becomes much more difficult to obtain a representative sample of even natural sediments in streams oftentimes just by doing a grab sample. You have to do more complicated flow integrated sampling. And when we come to microplastics, again, a suite of contaminants, wide range of particle sizes, wide range of compositions, wide range of densities, which means that actually this is a chart of different rising and settling velocities. They've been normalized, right? So that they're all positive. The blue is settling, the red star is another settling one. But anyway, the point is, even though this all looks positive, these are actually the range of magnitudes of settling and rising velocities for the kinds of particles you would find. So you have a wide range of particles that are, some of which are settling rapidly, some of which are rising rapidly. And there's ramifications for that when we're actually sampling them. That means that here, this is just a schematic showing normalized depth if you're looking down through a water column, normalized concentration, one being the total concentration. So, and these are different kinds of transport modes. So not only do we have settling suspended sediments for microplastics, potentially bed load or even things that are immobile that aren't moving, we also have wash load, right? Which is great, right? Things that have the same concentration throughout the flow field. But unlike natural mineral sediment, we also have rising suspended load where we have higher concentrations as we move towards the surface. And we have surface load for some kinds of particles under some kind of flow conditions where you basically only find it at the surface, right? And this leads to, and we've done some simple modeling that back this up as well. And the point of all of this is that, I guess I could have skipped all of this and just said some plastics float, some plastics don't, and you have to sample wisely. And so that's what we're trying to do. And you'll see in a minute what that looks like. The other issue is that we have to sample enough particles. Not a problem when it comes to most natural fluvial sediments, particularly as you get into suspended load. You have a tremendous number of particles. You get as many as you want. But with microplastics, this is a good thing, right, for the environment. In some systems, the concentrations are very low, and we're thinking about concentration in terms of cubic meters. So you have, and that's particularly the case for the coarser fraction. So in general, we have there's a wide range of particle size distributions of sizes for microplastics, but in general, you find fewer numbers of the larger particles and many, many more numbers of the smaller particles as you get into smaller size classes. And so if your representativeness of your sample is constrained by the number of particles that you're sampling, it's much easier in that sense to sample for fine microplastics because, as I just mentioned, one, they're more likely to be wash load. They're more likely to be easy to sample across the flow field. But two, there's a lot more of them, right, in any given system relative to the coarse stuff. So you can get by with, sampling on the scale of liters or tens of liters or maybe hundreds of liters. Whereas with coarse microplastics, we're often talking about cubic meters of water. What does that mean in practice? For coarse microplastics, that either means pumping large volumes of water through a sieve, which is challenging, particularly for stormflow, because you have lots of stuff coming down our rivers. And if you're trying to pump stuff up, that means you have a tube that's going in. Or you use a net, which is also challenging because nets have a lot of form drag and also run into lots of difficulties when you lower them into our raging rivers here during stormflow. So what does this look like in the field? What we do, well, the reason we got into this in the first place I mentioned is because we thought we could contribute something as hydrologists who study natural sediment moving through rivers. So we already have the kind of gear that we need to sample plastics in rivers with some modifications. And so we're using this device. This is a this is a BL, it's a BL84 USGS bedload sampler. It weighs, I think, 65 pounds. It's a steel frame. It has this little bag on the back. Usually you'd just be moving it along the bottom, and you're actually assuming that you're capturing all the bed load for a given increment of the width of the stream. In this case, we're lowering it down through the flow field, and then we're marching it across and lowering it up and down, and so on and so forth, to obtain a flow integrated sample. That means we can't rely on just knowing the gap across the mouth of this. We have to know the volume that we're sampling. So we have to retrofit it with a flow meter that measures the intake velocity, because we also can't rely on just knowing the velocity of the stream, because you'll have a lot of issues of backwater effects with this net, and it changes over time as it gets occluded. And then for just the bulk water samples that we're collecting, also in a flow integrated fashion for fine microplastics, and that's, you know, nominally, this is like, you know, above 5 millimeters for coarse, fine microplastics, 1 to 100 microns. You'll notice there's a gap here. That gap is a problem. I'm not going to talk about it more. We do sample those, but it's a problem to sample them in a representative fashion in some cases. And then we just collect on the order of liters, right? During storm flow, challenging. During dry flow, also challenging, as I'll mention. Dry summer flow, you can just go down into the stream, particularly if you're working with the counties and you get permission to do so. We have a special large intake net specifically fabricated for this purpose. We can lower it in. It works great. It's not dangerous, really, but we have a lot of algae that grows in these streams in the summers, and we end up with tremendous amounts of algae in many cases that we also have to sort through and digest to get to our microplastics. For coarse microplastics, we're lowering nets. And as I said, you look into this river, this is actually the Santa Ana River. You can see a lot of energy, right? Also, it looks like chocolate milk, a lot of sediment, right? So we end up capturing lots of mineral sediment. We also deal with lots of large debris that are coming down. And so as you can see back here, you know, when we're doing this, we usually try to have at least 4 people out there. You need, during storm flow conditions, because you need a spotter to spot the trees and mattresses and whatever else is coming down the river. And we still end up with lots of challenging and variable sample compositions. So, oh yeah, that's right. I accidentally split up our marsh sampling, but anyway, here's a little more details on our marsh sampling for the upper bay, lower bay, and our wetlands. Yeah, I mentioned the wetlands. For the subaqueous or benthic samples that we're going to collect for sediment, I forgot to mention, we'll be doing that from boats and using small gravity cores, and it may devolve into grab sampling depending on how things go. So anyway, what does this look like back in the lab? You've gone through all this trouble to try to get a representative sample, let's say of, you know, water or stuff that you're netting out of the water. One, you have to go back into the lab with that material, and you have to, the idea is you have to extract the microplastics out of whatever matrix you're left with, and most of it is not going to be microplastics. And then you have to identify those plastics, right? Because lots of stuff looks like plastic, but it starts with morphological identification, then it moves on from there. So the extraction procedure that we use, it's similar to what many people use. I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically it involves, if we're starting, say, with a bulk water sample, you're filtering it down to get the water out of there, right? And you have to filter down to whatever your minimum size is that you're analyzing. And then usually it involves a really strongly oxidizing procedure to remove organic material, then density separation to remove plastics from mineral sediment, because there's always a lot of mineral sediment here in SoCal. But of course, all of this produces problems. There's a wide range of plastic composition, and some plastics are denser than the density separation solution that we're using. And so we're just going to miss those, right? And that's just unfortunately how it is. And for this case, and if you want to try to account for those, then you have to do some other kinds of subsampling. We do size class fractionation, those are sieves. And then eventually we move on to microscopy and spectroscopy to identify them morphologically, and then also identify them in terms of their chemical composition. So for the particle morphometrics, we can use bright field microscopy, which we do, and fluorescence microscopy. We're also working with semi-automated image analysis. So we take these digital images, digital micrographs of our plastics. A lot of this is actually macroplastics in this case. And then we can pull off we can, in a semi-automated fashion, pull off their perimeter. And from there, we can get size, we can get all kinds of shape information, et cetera. And there's a lot of other taxonomic and morphological work that's done on the bright field coarser particles, where you can actually manipulate them to do initial identification and characterization. But all of that has to, these days, really has to be backed up by analytical chemistry techniques, right? Because in the early days of microplastics research, you could get by with just say, well, it passed these different morphological and other tests, and we think that it's mostly plastic. But these days you have to use these techniques for good reason, because there's lots of other things that look like plastic. It includes things like Raman spectroscopy, FTIR spectroscopy, and there's some other interesting new techniques, not necessarily new, but people are using other techniques that are helping us, again, solve the problem of a broad and complex suite of contaminants, because some of the kinds of plastics you just can't analyze with Raman or FTIR. So, but again, this is on a particle by particle basis, right? These two kinds of, doing micro Raman, micro FTIR, for the most part, you're going through and you're shooting individual particles, very time consuming. Although this is moving on towards some chemical imaging or semi-automated particle characterization, which is potentially speeding things up, but also resulting in huge amounts of data that people have to handle. And that's something that our group is dealing with as well. Another problem is, once you obtain these spectra, one, the kinds of software that you have to work with, most of them cost money, and they usually cost thousands of dollars, right? It's professional software. And two, the libraries, if you obtain these spectra, in order to figure out what that means, you have to have libraries of reference spectra, right, to compare them to. And so there aren't a lot of reference spectra for plastics. And the ones that do exist, many you used to have to pay for, and many also were, they tend to be quote unquote virgin plastics that are hot off the industrial line. They haven't been exposed to weathering processes, et cetera. And so the community of microplastics practitioners, many of us have been just developing our own libraries independently, and then also using these off-the-shelf software products that we have to pay for. And so again, this grad student of mine is a bit of an anarchist. He decided that was unacceptable. He's also a free and open data evangelist. He's even convinced me. We've had lots of arguments and he won. But he wasn't content with the fact that that was the current state of things, so he decided to change it. So he wrote his own software program, OpenSpeccy, and he set up, not only is that housed in the cloud, but also it houses an open access library that people can utilize and also contribute to with QA/QC procedures involved. And it's developing into one of the largest open access spectral libraries for microplastics at this point. And so that paper was just published this past year. And that's some more about OpenSpeccy. The other issue, as I alluded to before, okay, so you go through and you do all this work and you sample your particles, you characterize them. Well, all of these methods I was just talking about, none of them are standardized. Most of us are using our own methods. It's the wild, wild west, right? We're all just trying to kind of go out there and characterize these things, see what's happening. But this is where the analytical chemists have really, I think, in large part, continue to help this field along. They really understand QA/QC, AQA. So there's been this really big push for harmonization and standardization, both in terms of methodology, but also in terms of reporting, so that we can have reproducibility and also comparability and synthesis across the field. And my group has been involved with that as well. And we've also been collaborating with SQUIRP, who are heading up a big interlaboratory comparison study that involves over 30 labs around the world. And yeah, so QA/QC is another huge problem. I don't want to talk about it much, but the main point is, why are we worried about microplastics? It's everywhere. It's also on us. It's in our laboratories. It's a tremendous problem. So we have, in terms of contamination. So if you know a little bit about analysis of anything in the laboratory, one of your major limiting factors in terms of limit of detection or limit of quantitation is your blank rate, right? And so there's no lab has a zero blank for microplastics. We're all contaminated, and the idea is to try to reduce contamination and keep it stable, and then account for it in a very open and transparent manner. Because at the end of the day, all these measures that we have, they don't really mean anything without an uncertainty around them. And this plays a big role in that. So I'm almost done. Even though this is the part that I really love, because this is one of the things that I really focus on. Flux, right? The dynamics of transport and how much of this material is actually, moving through these river systems and going from one water body to the next. When it comes to anything that's being transported by rivers, the water that's in that river, that water is an expression of the watershed, right? It's an expression of a convolution of internal factors, internal to the watershed, the characteristics of the watershed, with external factors, namely climate, weather, that conspire to produce that discharge signal. The same thing with anything that's going into the water, including plastics, right? That's a story about the watershed, its internal, external forcing factors that then conspire to produce this concentration signal in the river, which is also dependent to some degree on the discharge. The first thing we usually look at for particulate transport is a dependence of the concentration of that material on the discharge itself. That's what we expect to find from microplastics, this kind of increasing concentration with increasing discharge. It turns out in some places people are finding that, in other places it's much more complicated. And then you have to multiply those concentrations by discharge again to get flux. But for natural sediments, we see a huge range of variability in concentration around even this dependence of concentration on discharge. And it's turning out to be just as crazy for microplastics for these kinds of rivers. And so I won't go too far into it because we don't have enough data yet to really nail it down, but there are a lot of interesting transport stories that are going on that will hopefully start to unravel over the next couple of years. In terms of just the early things we're finding in say San Diego Creek and the Santa Ana Del High Channel and these other rivers that we're looking at in the region, just from a composition perspective, we're finding a lot of tire wear particles. And that's actually also what you would expect to find if you have read some of the literature coming out of other, highly urbanized systems. A lot of tire wear particles, and there are actual specific aquatic concerns and potential impacts that have been directly tied to tire wear particles recently as well. And so that's something that we'll be looking at more. And yeah, SFEI and their study of San Francisco Bay, all the colors kind of blend together here, but this light pink that you see, this big bar on the bottom, all the way across, except for this one creek, all of the rest of them, the majority of their fragments that they're finding, that morphology of fragments, were these unknown, potentially rubbery black fragments. They've since this was published, they've gone further down the line to identify those as tire wear particles. Right, it's a big concern, and that where they didn't find them, that was their least developed watershed, as you'd expect, with the least roads, the least amount of urbanization, etc. So our eyes are open to that, and we're finding it. And so, what does all this mean? Now I'm finishing. What does all this mean? Why do we care? Right? Sure, we're producing a lot of plastics, and yeah, we're finding plastics, basically microplastics everywhere, and we're probably going to produce more of it. Does that even matter? Well, some of the nascent modeling studies that are trying to predict how much microplastics and plastics we'll end up seeing, say in the pelagic oceans in the future. Yeah, it looks like we'll see a tremendous amount more. As you'd expect, even if we turn this tap off, would continue to see more for some period of time due to transport lags. But does more matter? Is this really a contaminant of concern? Are there impacts from these contaminants on aquatic organisms and humans? That's still really poorly constrained. There have been a lot of toxicological studies. Many of them haven't necessarily been designed in a way that they can provide solid evidence for certain levels of risk for human health or for aquatic organisms. Some of the recent studies that have tried to synthesize that have suggested that most rivers and global oceans are currently at low to very low risk, but that a small proportion of highly polluted sites are likely at risk, and that those highly polluted sites will probably, may expand in aerial coverage by as much as tenfold over the next 100 years. So still a lot of questions, but as we continue to produce more plastic, potentially a much bigger problem. Here in California, people are thinking about this a lot. The government is pouring resources into trying to better understand this problem. This is a good publication. I'd suggest that you take a look at it if you're worried about this problem and want to know more about what California agencies and researchers are doing to start to develop a framework for scientific guidance and assessment, particularly in this case for the marine environment. But there's a lot of work being done for drinking water in particular right now, and also for freshwater aquatic systems more and more. Oh, so with that, thank you very much for your attention, for sticking through it. I think it looks like I missed a couple questions. I'll be happy to answer those now and whatever other questions you have. So cheers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very informative talk. And I'm, again, just so glad that we have you here tonight. Jamie had asked a question earlier. Her question was, is it worth it to continue NBC volunteer efforts to pick up macroplastics in Newport Bay? This stuff comes in weekly into the area regardless of the frequency of volunteer cleanups, so it is overwhelming. And I'll just give you a little bit of context on that. Jamie is one of our awesome volunteers who actually started a cleanup here in the Bay. And some of our volunteers were leading a cleanup twice a month. And we were doing that for, I think, a year or two up until the pandemic hit, and we haven't restarted those yet. But
Right.
Yeah, so that is it worth it to continue doing that? My kind of follow-up question was going to be, is there a way that we could help your lab with monitoring macroplastics in the Bay, because that was an event that we had going on?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I like that it cuts right to the point. Should we even be doing this, right? I ask myself those kinds of things all the time. And at the end of the day, it depends on what your goals are, right? It always starts with what your goals are and whether the activity that you're doing services those goals adequately or not. My opinion on remediation activities like that are that they're tremendously valuable. First, for the group that's doing them, because you obtain all of this group activity and effervescence that comes along with doing that kind of thing for your environment, and you're one of the main human beneficial uses of that environment are people going and enjoying it. And the fact is, right, you're all, I imagine many of you are affiliated with Newport Bay because it's one of our last remaining wetlands, right? California has, I think, less than 5% of the wetlands that it used to have, right? So every last little bit is very, very precious. that can be frustrating for me sometimes because it means there's a big ream of red tape for me to do anything in those wetlands at all, right? But I understand, and so, doing the hard work to go out and remediate those sites and keep them clean, I think is tremendously valuable for all of those human beneficial uses outside of your group as well. And let's face it, there's lots of questions about the impacts and the potential impacts of microplastics on aquatic organisms. A lot of those questions have been answered for macro materials, right? It's a lot of issues with entanglement and ingestion. And so even if, many of those materials, some of them may get incorporated into the sediments, many of them may eventually advected out of the system, they're going to go somewhere else and potentially impact other organisms. So I think those are all good reasons to continue to do it. Another good reason, and it's not as important, perhaps, but it's also a great potential opportunity to collect data. And so thanks, Hillary, for mentioning that, thinking about that and getting out ahead of that. It would be fantastic if when your group starts collecting those data again, or starts doing those kinds of activities again, if you decide that it makes sense for your goals, so to chat with us about data collection. I don't know if you've collected any data on that in the past, but man, it's not, as I mentioned before, that's something we've been thinking about a lot. It's a lot of good applications that make it easy, and we have more harmonized data card production that goes along with our taxonomy that we developed that helps guide people through the development of their own data cards to try to tailor it to optimize it for your goals and for the amount of effort you want to spend, but then also preserve as much harmonization and cross comparability with other data cards as well. So would love to chat with you all more about that, and link you in with my broader research group and our work on that. Yeah, and would love to come out and do some cleanups with you too.
Yeah, I'd love to talk with you more on that. When we did these cleanups before, we weren't really collecting data. And part of the reason for that was, like you mentioned, there's so many different data cards out there. We weren't really sure what the best one was to use, and also how that data was going to be used. And so where that data was going to go, what was our purpose in collecting it. So if we could connect it with your lab, I think that would be just awesome.
Yeah, fantastic. And I might have sold that a little bit short. I should backtrack and say that those data can be very, very valuable, not only for someone like me who just wants to understand fate and transport to some degree, but really also to drive the development of policy, because it's those data sets that are showing the most prevalent items that are out there. And there's a big move now also to incorporate branding, which my group has been involved with to some degree as well, and there are policy ramifications of that too, namely trying to put more pressure on the producers and less of it onto the individual consumer.
Yeah, that's great. I will talk more about that. I don't want to take too much time because we do have a couple more questions. Drew, did you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Drew.
Yeah, I go to Orange Coast College quite often, maybe twice a year to sell my plastics. And I'm receiving less and less income from those returns. I've heard that China has really cut back on purchasing our recyclable plastics. Have you heard much about that?
Yeah, and I didn't really address some of the broader problems with the plastic cycle, the plastic sort of industrial consumer cycle, outside of some of it getting into the mismanaged waste stream and entering into the environment. But yeah, there's a huge crisis going on right now in terms of recyclable plastics, because for a long period of time, as we were shipping, both us and other developed, quote unquote, developed countries in Europe as well, we're shipping a lot of our plastics for recycling out to places like China, where they're being purchased and then recycled, and they have enough internal production to suit their recycling needs now. And that, I mean, that's a really simplified take on the situation, but the upshot is our recycling stream, which still isn't, it's not a fat enough band of the amount of material that's being produced and thrown away, but the part that's being routed to recycling has been going down because of that part of the cycle getting cut off. And I don't specialize in that, but it's a big problem. And it's, well, this is going up on YouTube, so that's all I'm going to say. It's something for a broader conversation as well. I mean, that's where a lot of the big issues are: production, and then the managed stream for all of this material.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Peter Lamb had a question in the chat. Peter, do you want to ask your question? Not sure if he's there. Peter had asked, are there any books that you or anyone else here would recommend for adopting a reduced plastic or plastic-free lifestyle?
Yeah, no books come to mind. There's definitely a lot of books that have been written on this, and none of them come to the top of my mind. But I can follow up with your group and send you some good links to different groups that we have worked with and that we know who, advocate moving away from plastic. So like Break Free from Plastic, Let's Do It World, 5 Gyres. But if you follow up with me, Hillary, I'll try to remember to send you a list of links. And I can also send you some books too that my graduate students have probably read. I think I find as I get older, I haven't had enough time to read books lately. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll send out a follow-up email to everyone as well. And so I can pass those along. Rita had a question. Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, I used to be a TIFL educator in Laguna Beach, and we'd pick up plastics and the nurdles, I guess they're the tiniest bits of styrofoam, that those never go away, that they will never ever go away. And I'm sure this stuff in our waterways and stuff has an impact on our bodies, on our health. I don't know, I came in a little late. Has there been any studies on plastics accumulating in people's bloodstreams?
Yeah, there've been a lot, and you didn't miss it. I didn't really touch on the organismal and the toxicological side of things, but there have been a lot of studies, and there's a lot of concern about, especially for human health impacts. And people have been finding microplastics in organ tissues, in humans, and all across lots of different organisms. There's still a lot to learn, but it seems like the things that we are potentially going to be most concerned about are the smaller size fraction. So the smaller size particles that can cross tissues, can cross cell barriers. And those are also the microplastics that are the hardest for us to actually characterize right now. So the studies that I've been talking about today, I didn't go into as much detail, but the smallest size particles that we're going to be able to characterize will probably be down around 20 to 50 microns. And that's that's where you're starting to get into some of those sizes that may be the biggest problem. But
are they saying what kind of health problems that it could create?
Well, there's a wide range of potential problems, but in terms of linking microplastics to specific like disease in people, I don't think that's happened yet. Although there are, there's some kind of more public health oriented studies that have indicated some potential risks. But my point here is just to say that it's still really early times. Yeah.
Don't drink it.
Well, we're certainly finding a lot more microplastics in plastic bottled drinking water than you will find in your municipal water in your home. So that's a good thing. That's something that I keep in mind personally.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
I had a quick question. So the sampling of this sounds like a complete nightmare. And so I had a couple of quick questions, which was first, we've heard about people in the Bay who are going to be looking at toxins accumulating in shellfish, for example, the filter feeders. Is anyone using the sort of the natural filter feeders in the environment to sort of help do some of your sampling for you and accumulate some of these plastics? And the second question I had was, are you more concerned about those things that float because they tend to stay in the environment and get further out and potentially into the food supply? Is that something that is more of a concern from the environment?
Yeah, really good questions. So in terms of the first question, it's funny because I submitted a proposal to do just what you were suggesting, right? Like, oh, we could exploit these little oysters. You know, it was actually going to be in Delaware Bay with a collaborator at Drexel. We didn't get funded in that case, but it would have been great. They process a tremendous amount of water. There's lots of issues, and we were going to do some laboratory experiments and stuff too. But there are a lot of concerns with filter feeders in particular because they are just processing so much water, and they are finding it in them. And of course, it turns out that a lot of the larger particles probably in a lot of those critters makes its way out. They depoperate and stuff, but it's the finer particles and finer fibers that can cross through those organ barriers. Yeah. So yeah, we're not doing any of that organismal work yet here in California, but there are people up in UC Davis, I know, that are, and also at UC San Diego. Cheers. On the other question, sorry, the floating, the surface transport. Yeah, I mean, we haven't been working on the larger scale modeling of transport, although we're collaborating with modelers at SQUIRP. And so we'll have some more of our own answers to that, but there's other groups that are doing that kind of particle transport modeling, particularly in coastal zones. And yeah, the lower density materials are going to travel further, most likely, but that changes over time too as particles get broken down into smaller particles. You also have flocculation and aggregation of particles that happens with biofilms, and so things can change over time. Yeah, they're also exposed to a lot more UV, so they get broken down more quickly. Yeah. Great questions.
Yeah, great questions. Anyone else have any questions? Not. Someone just asked, will you be sending out the recording? Yes, this recording will be going up on YouTube. It should be there in just about 2 weeks, and it'll be on Newport Bay Conservancy's YouTube channel. Mason, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask what the average person can do to help put pressure on brands or corporations like you were suggesting to be more accountable for this plastic, because I think that's really how the change will start, at least in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's not one that I'm an expert in, but from my own personal opinion, I think that there are a lot of great groups whose mission statement is to do just what you're talking about. So getting affiliated with those groups, speaking to your representatives and local, state, federal government about these problems, and then joining forces with others that are doing the same thing. And, as we were talking about data earlier, collecting the kinds of data that help to inform eventually the kind of change that we're talking about is also very valuable. And then that's, all of those things are, any individual person is just a very small part of that, but it takes a lot of people. So yeah, there's a lot to do there. And there's a lot of great groups. There's a lot of great groups here in SoCal that are involved in that.
Andrew, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the contamination from rubber tire fragments, because there must be it must be known how much tire material disappears on our roads, and it must be enormous. Do you have any data on how much ends up in the waterways and where it goes?
I haven't collected those data myself, but you're absolutely right. There have been a number of studies that have done that have gone through and tried to generate those budgets. And the numbers are enormous. Yeah, and also, we incorporate things that are like tire wear particles into the asphalt that we're paving those roads with as well, which also breaks down. And yeah, I was just looking at a study just yesterday in prep for this talk where someone was going through and working that budgeting out of the different kinds of particulates that are produced on roadways, including brake pad wear as well. And it's a lot of material, and clearly significant amounts of it get into waterways. And in terms of, that's also a material where that has been tied to some specific impacts on aquatic organisms already as well. So that's a big topic that's going to receive a lot of attention over the next over the coming years. Yeah.
Could you send us some references on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, and Julie, yes, I am. We do send our C14 to UCI. Yeah. That's a fantastic facility for AMS
Sorry,
facility.
it's a really specific question, but I used to work in that lab, so I was just curious about whether you were going to.
That's my favorite C14 lab that I've worked with so far. So
It's great.
Well done.
Diana had a question in the chat. I'm not sure if all of it came through. What is being done on the industrial level for the areas we probably will continue to need plastic for?
So I think maybe Diana means like because I mean, there's a tremendous amount of plastic that's being produced. It's being produced for lots of different reasons. And again, this isn't my field of expertise, but a big part of that acceleration of plastic production, it's not just for durable items where, hey, we really got to use plastic for this, nothing else is going to work. A lot of that is it's packaging, it's single-use food items, it's the use of plastics in disposable goods. So I don't think the lowest hanging fruit isn't cutting back on plastics and durable goods where it really makes sense to use plastics. It's all this other stuff that we just don't need, frankly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any other questions for Andrew?
A lot of people pick up a lot of their supplies at the market in plastic bags. Do you have any kind of a flyer that has been produced that lets people know why that's a bad idea?
My group hasn't produced a flyer like that, no, but that's one area where we've seen a lot of local scale work that's been done, across the US and particularly here in California, and particularly in SoCal, where we've had, well, actually, I forget, is it, what's the, and I forget, so is it a statewide ban at this point for plastic bags, or is that still on the sort of local to county level? I can't remember what the exact state is currently.
They're still handing out plastic bags at grocery stores.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I meant like a ban on, free plastic bags, right? Things have kind of gone in steps, but yeah, we haven't produced any material on that, but it's another one of the major culprits of plastic pollution. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that ban was on a state level, but it didn't really apply to everything because we still have those plastic bags for produce at the grocery store and they still give them out at some stores. So yeah.
Farmers markets, they're still handing out tons of plastic bags.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, again, for being here, for telling us all about this work. I learned so much tonight, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you. Hopefully we can help out your lab with some of that data collection on the macroplastics at least. And we'll be in touch with some of those resources. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you all. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to my group learning more about Newport Bay from your group, because we're newly entering this system. So
yeah, so as I said, that our naturalist training, the reason that this is our last naturalist night of the year is because our naturalist training starts next month on September 9th. So we will be having talks now every Thursday night, starting September 9th. Hopefully those will continue to be virtual as well as in person. And then as a follow-up to this talk, we have our Coastal Cleanup Day coming up on September 18th. So we hold a big event with locations all around the Bay. And if your lab members are interested in coming out and joining us, that would be awesome.
And you said that was September 18th?
Yeah.
All right. Great.
Yeah, so it's we hold that event every year. It's the third Saturday of September. So it lines up with just the International Coastal Cleanup Day.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, if there's a chance that we're going to be out doing some marine sampling on a boat that day, but if not, I'd love to be there.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, have a good night and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.